When the world shut down in March 2020, chaos and fear consumed every corner of society. Businesses closed their doors, families locked themselves indoors, and a mysterious virus dominated every conversation. But for one woman in Jupiter, Florida, this global crisis would become the perfect cover for something far more sinister. This is the story of Gretchen Anthony, a vibrant mother whose disappearance during the early days of the pandemic exposed a web of lies, manipulation, and deadly deception. What began as concerning text messages about a coronavirus diagnosis would unravel into one of the most chilling cases ever investigated in Palm Beach County. Picture this: a seemingly healthy 51-year-old woman suddenly vanishes without a trace, leaving behind only suspicious text messages claiming she contracted COVID-19. Her family grows increasingly worried when phone calls go unanswered and the messages become more bizarre by the hour. Then investigators make a disturbing discovery that changes everything. The case would span multiple states, involve a desperate manhunt, and reveal how someone used the world's greatest fear as a weapon. By the time the truth emerged, it would expose not just a calculated murder, but a perpetrator who exploited a global pandemic to commit the perfect crime, or so he thought. In early 2020, Jupiter, Florida seemed like paradise. This affluent community in Palm Beach County attracted successful professionals, retirees, and families seeking the good life under endless blue skies. Among its residents was Gretchen Anthony, a woman whose infectious smile and boundless energy made her impossible to forget. At 51, Gretchen embodied everything about healthy Florida living. She maintained an impressive fitness routine, worked out religiously at the local gym, and took exceptional care of her health. Those who knew her described a woman who radiated positivity and lived life to the fullest. But above everything else, Gretchen was devoted to her 12-year-old daughter, who remained the center of her universe. After her divorce, Gretchen had found love again with David Anthony, a personal trainer she met at her gym. David stood out immediately. At 6 feet 7 inches tall with a charming personality, he commanded attention wherever he went. He quickly became one of the most popular trainers at the facility, known for his intelligence, charisma, and ability to connect with clients. The attraction between Gretchen and David was undeniable. Friends described sparks flying whenever they were together, and their relationship progressed quickly. In 2015, the couple made their union official with a wedding ceremony at an Elvis chapel in Las Vegas. For those who knew them, they seemed like the perfect match. Two attractive, successful people who had found their soulmates. David embraced his role as stepfather to Gretchen's daughter, who affectionately called him her bonus dad. To outside observers, they appeared to be living a dream life in their beautiful Jupiter home. Gretchen continued thriving in her career, while David built his reputation as one of the area's most sought-after fitness professionals. But behind closed doors, cracks began forming in their seemingly perfect relationship. By late 2019, those close to the couple noticed tension building. Friends later recalled that both Gretchen and David seemed to be searching for their individual identities within the marriage. The pressures of blending families, career demands, and personal expectations began taking their toll. The fairy tale came to an abrupt end when the couple separated in late 2019. David moved out of their shared home, leaving Gretchen to navigate single motherhood once again while maintaining her demanding career. Despite the separation, they attempted to keep things amicable for the sake of Gretchen's daughter, who had grown attached to the man she considered her bonus dad. What none of their friends could have predicted was how this separation would set the stage for events that would shock the entire community. March 2020 brought unprecedented fear to America. News reports filled the airwaves with updates about a mysterious virus spreading across the globe. Italy had shut down completely. New York City was becoming the epicenter of a national health crisis. Grocery store shelves sat empty as people stockpiled supplies for an uncertain future. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis was facing mounting pressure to issue statewide lockdown orders. Palm Beach County officials had already declared a state of emergency, urging residents to stay home unless absolutely necessary. Schools closed indefinitely. Businesses shuttered their doors, and families found themselves trapped in their homes with mounting anxiety about an invisible enemy. For Gretchen Anthony, March 21st started like any other day during this strange new reality. She had work obligations to fulfill and responsibilities as a single mother to maintain. Despite the chaos surrounding the pandemic, she remained committed to her routine and her daughter's well-being. But that morning, something went terribly wrong. When Gretchen failed to show up for work, her colleagues initially assumed she might be dealing with pandemic-related issues. After all, everyone was adjusting to new realities and unexpected changes to their schedules. However, their concern grew when they couldn't reach her by phone throughout the day. Then came the text messages that would launch one of the most disturbing investigations in Palm Beach County history. Starting on March 23rd, family members and friends began receiving messages from Gretchen's phone. The first text went to her daughter, who was staying with her biological father due to the custody arrangement. The message was straightforward and concerning. She had tested positive for coronavirus that morning and would need to quarantine at home for at least 2 weeks. Her daughter responded with worry and well wishes, hoping her mother would recover quickly. But this would be the last normal exchange anyone would have with Gretchen's phone. Over the next several days, more messages arrived, describing a rapidly deteriorating condition. According to these texts, Gretchen had consulted with virus screening hotlines and eventually admitted herself to Jupiter Medical Center's emergency room. The messages painted a picture of someone fighting a serious battle with COVID-19, exactly the kind of scenario that terrified families across the country. But something felt wrong to those who knew Gretchen best. The woman they knew would never communicate only through text messages, especially during a health crisis. She was someone who picked up the phone to check on others constantly, always maintaining close contact with her inner circle. The idea that she would go days without speaking to anyone directly, including her own daughter, seemed completely out of character. Then the messages took an even stranger turn. According to texts allegedly from Gretchen's phone, she had been transferred to a specialized CDC facility in Belle Glade, Florida, more than an hour away from Jupiter. This facility, the messages claimed, was specifically designed to treat severe COVID-19 cases under direct federal oversight. Family members found this information both alarming and confusing. Why would someone be transferred so far from home? Why hadn't Gretchen called to explain the situation herself, and most importantly, why was she communicating exclusively through text messages when she was supposedly fighting for her life? Their questions multiplied when they tried to verify the information. A quick investigation revealed a shocking truth. There was no CDC facility in Belle Glade, Florida. The location mentioned in the text messages simply didn't exist. At that moment, everyone realized they weren't dealing with a COVID-19 case at all. Someone had been using Gretchen's phone to send false information, exploiting the fear and confusion surrounding the pandemic to cover up something far more sinister. The race to find Gretchen Anthony had begun, and investigators would soon discover that someone had planned the perfect crime using the world's greatest fear as their weapon. The investigation into Gretchen Anthony's disappearance began immediately After concerned family members contacted Jupiter police, what started as a routine welfare check quickly transformed into something far more ominous when officers arrived at Gretchen's home on a quiet residential street. Detective Jared Kennerson drew the assignment on the night shift. A seasoned investigator with years of experience, he initially approached the case with cautious optimism. Missing person reports weren't uncommon, and many resolved quickly with simple explanations. But as he began piecing together the timeline, red flags started appearing everywhere. The first major breakthrough came when investigators contacted Jupiter Medical Center directly. Hospital administrators confirmed what the family suspected. There was no record of Gretchen Anthony being treated at their facility during the time frame mentioned in the text messages. This revelation immediately elevated the case from a missing person inquiry to something potentially criminal. But the real shock came when officers checked the hospital's parking lot. There, sitting in plain view, was Gretchen's distinctive Mini Cooper. The small car seemed abandoned, unlocked, with her purse clearly visible on the passenger seat. For investigators, this discovery raised immediate concerns. What woman leaves her purse behind, especially during a supposed medical emergency? Detective Kennerson knew they were dealing with something serious. If Gretchen wasn't at the hospital being treated for COVID-19 and her car was sitting abandoned in the parking lot, then where was she? Armed with this new information, police began canvassing Gretchen's neighborhood. Officers went door to door, wearing body cameras, hoping someone had seen or heard something that might provide answers. What they discovered would haunt investigators for months to come. A neighbor approached the officers with information that made everyone's blood run cold. On the morning of Saturday, March 21st, around 6 in the morning, she had heard something that woke her from sleep. It wasn't just any noise. It was a woman's blood-curdling scream that seemed to pierce through the quiet suburban morning. The neighbor described hearing a woman screaming as if she was being attacked. She distinctly remembered hearing the word "no" shouted repeatedly, followed by desperate cries about pain and pleas for someone to stop. The screams were so intense and terrifying that they remained burned in her memory days later. When officers asked why she hadn't called 911 at the time, the neighbor admitted she felt uncertain about getting involved. It's a common hesitation many people experience, the fear of overreacting or intruding on what might be a private situation. But now, hearing about Gretchen's disappearance, she deeply regretted not trusting her instincts. The timing of these screams aligned perfectly with when Gretchen was last seen alive. Investigators now had a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it painted a horrifying picture of what might have happened in those early morning hours. As officers continued their canvass, another neighbor provided equally disturbing information. This resident had noticed something unusual later that same morning. A soapy, sudsy substance flowing from underneath Gretchen's garage doors. The liquid appeared to be running down the driveway and into the street, suggesting someone had been engaged in intensive cleaning inside the garage. For investigators, this observation was deeply troubling. Why would someone need to clean so thoroughly that soapy water was literally flowing out of the garage? The timing, coming just hours after the terrifying screams, suggested someone was attempting to destroy evidence of whatever had occurred. Detective Kennerson and his team approached Gretchen's house with growing concern. They immediately noticed something suspicious about the entrance from the patio into the garage. The door was locked, but more importantly, a key had been broken off inside the deadbolt mechanism. Someone had either broken the key accidentally during a struggle or intentionally to prevent entry. Unable to gain access through normal means, officers made the decision to force entry into the garage. They needed to determine if Gretchen might be inside, injured, or worse. What they found when they broke down the door confirmed their worst fears about what had transpired. The garage was empty of human life, but it told a story of violence and attempted cover-up. The overwhelming smell of cleaning agents filled the air, so strong it was almost unbearable. Someone had clearly spent considerable time and effort trying to sanitize the space, using industrial-strength products in an attempt to eliminate any trace evidence. With body cameras recording every detail, investigators systematically searched the entire house multiple times. Each room revealed new pieces of a disturbing puzzle. In the bedroom, they found a broken picture frame with glass shards scattered across Gretchen's bed. A towel discovered nearby showed what appeared to be blood-like stains, despite obvious attempts to clean it. The evidence painted a clear picture of a violent struggle that had taken place inside Gretchen's own home. Someone had attacked her, likely in the garage based on the extensive cleaning efforts, and then attempted to destroy any forensic evidence that might identify them. But investigators caught their first real break when neighbors provided photographs they had taken that morning. The images showed a black Nissan pickup truck parked near Gretchen's home around the time the screams were heard. This vehicle would become a crucial piece of evidence in identifying their primary suspect. The truck belonged to David Anthony, Gretchen's estranged husband. As investigators dug deeper into David's background and recent activities, a disturbing pattern began emerging. Family members revealed that Gretchen had filed for divorce just 1 month earlier, in February 2020. The separation hadn't been amicable, and David had been forced to move in with his mother after leaving their shared home. Friends and family described David as increasingly unstable following the separation. His behavior had become erratic, and those who knew him best noticed dramatic mood swings that seemed to intensify as the divorce proceedings moved forward. Gretchen herself had expressed concerns about her safety, concerns that would prove tragically prophetic. The most telling evidence came from Gretchen's own preparation for potential danger. Family members told investigators that she had recently installed security cameras throughout her home and garage, specifically because David had been returning to the property uninvited after their separation. She felt unsafe and wanted video documentation of any future incidents. When investigators searched for these cameras, they made a chilling discovery. Every single camera had been ripped from the walls, obviously in an attempt to destroy any incriminating footage. But the person who removed them had made a critical error. They didn't understand how modern security systems work. While the physical cameras were gone, all the footage they had recorded was automatically stored in cloud-based servers. The images and videos that someone desperately tried to destroy were sitting safely on remote servers, waiting to tell their story to investigators. Detective Kennerson immediately obtained search warrants for the cloud storage accounts. What they would find in those digital files would provide the most damning evidence in the case and reveal exactly what happened during Gretchen Anthony's final moments. But first, they needed to find David Anthony, who had seemingly vanished into thin air just as thoroughly as his estranged wife. The search for David Anthony became a multi-state manhunt that would test the limits of law enforcement cooperation during the early days of the pandemic. With airports shut down and travel restrictions in place, investigators knew they had to move fast to prevent their prime suspect from disappearing forever. David's mother had told police he was headed to Costa Rica, giving him what appeared to be the perfect escape plan. International borders were closing rapidly due to COVID-19 restrictions, but someone determined enough might still find a way through. The clock was ticking, and every hour that passed gave David more distance between himself and justice. Detective Kennerson coordinated with federal authorities to track cell phone pings from both Gretchen's and David's devices. What they discovered was deeply troubling. Both phones appeared to be traveling together westward across Texas, then into New Mexico. For investigators, this created a terrifying possibility. Could Gretchen still be alive? being held against her will. The phone tracking revealed a methodical journey across multiple states. David's phone would ping briefly in one location, then go dark for hours before appearing hundreds of miles away. This pattern suggested someone who understood how cell phone tracking worked and was attempting to stay ahead of law enforcement. Meanwhile, the evidence retrieved from Gretchen's cloud storage painted a horrifying picture of her final moments. Security footage showed a tall figure lurking in the shadows of her patio in the early morning hours of March 21st. The person moved stealthily around the property, clearly familiar with the layout and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When Gretchen appeared on camera, the footage captured the moment she was ambushed and forced into the garage. The struggle was brief but violent, ending when the attacker looked directly up at one of the security cameras, realized it was recording, and violently ripped it from the wall. But the most chilling evidence came from Gretchen's Alexa device. Audio recordings captured her desperate attempts to call for help, shouting commands for the smart speaker to dial 911. Tragically, unless specifically programmed to do so. Alexa devices don't automatically contact emergency services. Gretchen's cries for help fell on digital deaf ears. The manhunt intensified when investigators received reports of David selling jewelry at various pawn shops across Florida and Texas. Security cameras captured him at multiple locations, always alone, claiming the jewelry belonged to a family member who had died from COVID-19. The cruel irony of his lie wasn't lost on investigators. He was using the very disease he'd falsely attributed to Gretchen as cover for disposing of her possessions. After days of tracking phone pings and coordinating with multiple law enforcement agencies, authorities finally located David in Las Cruces, New Mexico. Local police pulled over his distinctive black pickup truck and took him into custody for questioning. But without concrete evidence of murder, they couldn't hold him indefinitely. During initial questioning, David maintained his elaborate fiction. He claimed Gretchen was alive and being treated at a CDC facility, sticking to the same lies he'd been spreading through her phone. When pressed about the text messages, he became evasive and defensive, refusing to provide specific details about her supposed condition or location. Most disturbing of all, when officers searched his truck, they found both his phone and Gretchen's device. The discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected. David had been sending the false COVID-19 messages himself, using his wife's phone to create an elaborate cover story for her disappearance. But Las Cruces police didn't have enough evidence to charge David with murder. They seized his truck and phones as evidence, but were forced to release him on foot, with his dog Kobe as his only companion. David Anthony walked away from the police station, a free man, disappearing into the New Mexico landscape. For Detective Kennerson, watching his prime suspect walk away was agonizing. He knew David was responsible for Gretchen's death, but proving it would require the evidence analysis still pending back in Florida. The waiting game began, with investigators hoping David wouldn't vanish completely before they could build their case. The breakthrough came when Jupiter police finally received the complete security footage from Gretchen's home cameras. The images were too disturbing to release publicly, but they clearly showed David Anthony's face as he attacked his estranged wife and dragged her into the garage. At last, investigators had definitive proof of murder. Working around the clock, Las Cruces police launched an intensive search for David. They combed homeless shelters, hotels, and anywhere else a man on foot with a dog might seek refuge. The search seemed hopeless until officers spotted David walking Kobe through a residential neighborhood. The arrest was swift and decisive. David Anthony was taken into custody, and his beloved dog was transported to a local shelter. After a manhunt spanning 6 states and nearly 2,000 miles, the man who thought he'd committed the perfect crime was finally in handcuffs. But even in custody, David refused to reveal the location of Gretchen's body. During hours of interrogation, he maintained his innocence and insisted Gretchen was still alive. The psychological game continued, with David using the location of his wife's remains as leverage against the very investigators trying to bring her home to her family. After months of legal negotiations, David Anthony finally accepted a plea deal. In exchange for revealing where he'd hidden Gretchen's body, prosecutors agreed to reduce the charges from first-degree murder to second-degree murder, with a sentence of 38 years in prison. On a cold December morning in 2020, David led investigators to an unremarkable patch of grass behind a Walmart, just miles from where Gretchen had lived and died. There, buried in a shallow grave, they found the remains of a vibrant woman whose only crime was trying to rebuild her life after divorce. The autopsy revealed the brutal truth about Gretchen's final moments. She had died from multiple stab wounds to her neck and torso, with defensive wounds indicating she had fought desperately for her life. The neighbor's memory of hearing screams and pleas for someone to stop had been tragically accurate. At his sentencing hearing, David offered a bizarre explanation for his actions, claiming he'd viewed the pandemic as an end-of-world scenario that compelled him to commit murder. The excuse rang hollow to everyone present, including Gretchen's family members, who finally had their chance to confront her killer. Gretchen's sister spoke directly to David, calling him pure evil for stealing a mother from her child and a daughter from her parents. The courtroom was filled with grief and anger as family members shared their memories of a woman whose light had been extinguished by someone who claimed to love her. Today, Gretchen's daughter continues to heal with the support of her biological father and extended family. Though the trauma of losing her mother in such a horrific way will never fully fade, those who knew Gretchen find comfort in knowing her killer will spend decades behind bars. The case of Gretchen Anthony stands as a chilling reminder of how quickly domestic situations can turn deadly. It also reveals how someone attempted to exploit a global pandemic to cover their tracks, using the world's fear of COVID-19 as a weapon to deceive investigators and family members alike. For Detective Kennerson and the Jupiter Police Department, bringing Gretchen home represented more than just solving a case. It meant ensuring that a devoted mother's final resting place would be surrounded by those who loved her, not hidden away in shame behind a shopping center. The COVID cover-up had failed. Justice had been served. And Gretchen Anthony's memory lives on in the hearts of all those whose lives she touched during her 51 years of bringing light to the world. Sports often presents us with moments that go beyond the scoreboard. Moments that reveal deeper, sometimes darker, aspects. This isn't about the game-winning shot, the championship, or the fairy tale. This is about a powerful man, a video that holds more secrets than the camera can capture, and a nation's reflection on the culture behind it. It all started as a normal basketball practice at Rutgers University. Sneakers clicked on the floor, whistles blared in the gym, young players busily practicing and chasing their dreams. At the center of it all was head coach Mike Rice, strong, authoritative, and fierce. But behind the walls of the gym, something unusual happened. A video emerged. It was grainy and low quality, but its contents were unmistakable. Coach Mike Rice yelling at players, throwing basketballs at their heads and groins, grabbing their jerseys, kicking them, and shouting profanities. His behavior was no longer encouragement or love, but outright abuse, captured in disturbing detail. Then came the slurs. Homophobic insults hurled across the gym, directed at teenage athletes. At Rutgers, where such language carried a painful history, the words cut deeper than any physical harm. When the video leaked to the public, it spread rapidly, sparking outrage. Parents, students, alumni, and people everywhere were appalled. Calls for Mike Rice's firing dominated news cycles. Politicians spoke out. Even comedy shows like The Daily Show and Saturday Night Live mocked him. But beneath the satire, a serious conversation began to emerge. Was Mike Rice just a single bad coach? Or was his behavior evidence of a more systemic problem in sports culture? Up until then, Mike Rice was an obscure figure outside collegiate basketball. Overnight, he became a symbol of toxic coaching, unchecked power, and what happens when winning at all costs overshadows basic decency. New Jersey Governor Chris Christie voiced the nation's disbelief, saying that if Mike Rice had been Kobe Bryant's coach, he would have smacked the hell out of him. Soon, parents everywhere were asking a haunting question whether they would let that man coach their child. As the scandal erupted, Mike Rice vanished from the public eye, left to deal with the consequences, professionally, personally, and emotionally. He was fired, his reputation destroyed. At home, he faced his wife and children, knowing he had let them down. This story wasn't just about punishment. It became a reflection on anger, ego, toxic culture, and regret. And perhaps, in some ways, redemption. But if redemption was possible, it wouldn't come easily or quickly. Because some mistakes leave marks that time, and even apologies cannot erase. Before he became infamous as the coach who crossed the line, Mike Rice was just a kid who loved basketball. The sport was practically in his DNA. His mother had been a star college player, and his father, Mike Rice Sr., was a former coach and well-known NBA broadcaster. Mike Sr. was famously fiery, so much so that he remains the only NBA broadcaster ever ejected from a game, tossed out for arguing with a referee from the announcer's table. In the Rice household, basketball wasn't just a pastime, it was a way of life. The game shaped family dinners, fueled debates, and ignited passion. It wasn't seen as toxic. It was simply part of who they were. Mike Rice seemed destined to follow in his family's footsteps. He played college basketball and slowly climbed the coaching ladder. His journey was not an overnight success. Starting at smaller programs, he moved from assistant coaching roles to head coach positions, earning a reputation for relentless effort and intense dedication to the game. He was focused, determined, hungry. However, unchecked intensity can sometimes take a darker turn. Mike got his first taste of success at Robert Morris University, a small school in western Pennsylvania, where he transformed a struggling basketball team into a winner. Under his leadership, Robert Morris enjoyed a 3-year winning streak and earned a spot in the NCAA tournament. His energy and intensity were central to this turnaround. Practices were tough, often harder than the games. Mike believed that this pressure would build resilience, pushing his players to, and sometimes beyond, their limits. In the small school environment, with less media scrutiny and fewer critics, Mike's demanding style flourished. But success brought attention, and in 2010 he was hired as the head basketball coach at Rutgers University. Along with a 6-figure salary, Mike was given a daunting task to transform the struggling program in one of the country's premier conferences, the Big East. The pressure was immense. Rutgers had been stuck at the bottom of the Big East standings for years, and the program needed revitalization. Mike promised to provide that spark. At first, he appeared to deliver, injecting new energy and demanding more from his players. But away from the public eye, his intense methods started to raise concerns. At home, Mike's wife, Kathy, picked up on warning signs early: his language, anger, and emotional outbursts. She frequently addressed it with him, but the behavior didn't change. In Mike's mind, his methods weren't abusive. They were meant to prepare players for the harsh realities of basketball and life. He believed his intensity built toughness. To him, if his players couldn't handle his criticism, how would they handle high-pressure moments in games? He failed to realize he had already crossed a line on the court. Mike's temper became more apparent. He often yelled at referees, berated players, and even drew technical fouls. During one particularly heated game against Louisville, Mike was ejected. Alarmed by his behavior, the director asked him why. If he was such a great coach, he kept embarrassing the university. Mike saw it differently. Later, he said that he hadn't had an anger problem and that it was a myth. He explained that he had a control problem and had lost control, emphasizing that there was a difference. However, he ignored warnings from his wife, his bosses, and even his assistant coaches, all of whom had tried to curb his destructive behavior. Driven by his ambition to prove himself, Mike became increasingly tunnel-visioned, losing sight of the purpose of coaching. For a time, Mike's methods were overlooked because winning seemed to matter more than how he achieved it. Rutgers didn't fire him, choosing instead to wait and hope his behavior would improve. However, behind the scenes, someone was already taking action. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and assistant coach at Rutgers, had collaborated closely with Mike for many years. After Rutgers chose not to renew Eric's contract, he made a fateful decision, reviewing hours of internal practice footage, a public record since Rutgers is a state school. Eric compiled the worst examples of Mike's abusive behavior into a video and handed it over to the administration. That act set off a countdown to Mike's firing and the national scandal that would follow. Mike Rice came to Rutgers in 2010 as an unpolished but hungry coach who had transformed a small program into a winner. Unlike coaches with prestigious backgrounds or legendary mentors, Mike was scrappy and determined to prove he belonged. In a college sports culture fixated on immediate success, that hunger was enough for him to land the job. Rutgers needed change. After years of failure, the program had lost its fan base, student support, and financial backers. Mike promised to reignite passion, deliver results, and break the team out of its slump. At first, it appeared he might succeed, but his harmful methods ultimately overshadowed any progress he had made. From day one, he attacked his job with urgency. His approach was intense. He pushed players relentlessly, shouting and demanding more. Never satisfied, he wasn't a quiet or constructive coach. Instead, he screamed, cursed, and berated. Miss a defensive rotation, you'd get an earful. Fail a drill, you'd run it again and again, until you collapsed. Initially, some players respected his intensity, believing he was toughening them up, preparing them for pressure and the realities of life. They would say that was just how the coach was, and that he was old school. But his old school methods quickly crossed the line, repeatedly and behind closed doors. In the practice facility, his behavior escalated. He threw basketballs at players, sometimes at their legs, sometimes at their heads. He shoved them, yanked their jerseys, and hurled slurs, using homophobic insults like faggots, fairies, and sissies. He mocked and humiliated players. This wasn't an occasional lapse. It was systematic and ongoing abuse. This wasn't leadership. This was assault disguised as coaching. And the worst part, everyone saw it. Eric Murdoch, a former NBA player and respected figure in basketball, joined Mike's staff as the director of player development. At first, he supported Mike's vision, but what he witnessed shocked him. Disturbed, Eric started documenting the abuse. As a public university, Rutgers recorded all official team practices and stored the video footage. Eric sifted through hours of archived tape, compiling a reel of damning evidence. That reel would ultimately expose everything. But within the program, a toxic culture protected Mike. Despite numerous complaints, warnings, and internal reviews, no one stopped him. The athletic department knew. The university president knew. Some staff members spoke out, but their concerns were dismissed or ignored. Why? Because firing a head coach wasn't just a disciplinary decision, it was a financial one. Mike's contract included a substantial buyout. Firing him could cost Rutgers over $1 million. So they tried to manage the issue quietly, issuing a fine, suspending him for a few games, and requiring anger management classes. They gave no public explanation, no transparency. Meanwhile, the players were trapped. Many were on scholarships. Their future opportunities depended on staying in the coach's good graces. Speaking out could mean losing playing time, support, or even their spot on the team. Some transferred to other schools. Some stayed silent. A few tried to justify what was happening. The abuse continued. Mike didn't think he was doing anything wrong. In his mind, he was molding boys into men. Breaking them down would make them stronger. He saw himself as tough but fair. Having grown up in a household where yelling was normal and passion was loud, he didn't believe he was crossing any lines, but he ignored the signals. His staff's concerns, his family's warnings, and the quiet suffering of his players. Mike's wife, Kathy, had been begging him to change for years. After games, she would point to footage on TV, showing him his rage-filled face and choice of words. She urged him to think about their children, who were starting to hear rumors. But Mike dismissed her. In his mind, his methods would be validated by results. But the results weren't coming. Rutgers wasn't improving. Mike's win-loss record remained unimpressive, and the pressure on him grew. Boosters demanded more success. The athletic department became uneasy. With every outburst, he became harder to defend. And then, things finally reached a breaking point. After Rutgers chose not to renew Eric Murdoch's contract, he handed over the practice footage he had compiled to the athletic department again. This time, he delivered a clear ultimatum if action wasn't taken. He would make sure the footage became public. For months, no action was taken. Then, on April 2, 2013, ESPN's Outside the Lines released the footage to the public. What followed left America stunned. The videos revealed Rutgers basketball coach Mike Rice cursing, throwing balls at players' heads, hurling slurs, and physically grabbing athletes mid-practice. These weren't isolated incidents. The footage included dozens of clips, spliced together. They painted a horrifying picture of a coach completely out of control. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Social media exploded. News outlets replayed the footage non-stop. Sports radio slammed Rutgers for protecting Mike. Journalists began questioning who knew about the abuse and when. Students protested. Alumni threatened to cut off donations. Parents of players expressed their outrage. Within 24 hours, Mike Rice was fired, but the damage had already been done. The scandal quickly escalated. Rutgers athletic director Tim Pernetti, who had decided not to fire Mike earlier, resigned. The university's general counsel stepped down. The president of Rutgers faced intense criticism. Everyone involved in keeping the abuse under wraps was now under investigation. This was no longer just about Mike. It exposed deeper issues within college athletics. A culture that prioritized winning over player welfare. A system where money outweighed morality. A tradition where young athletes, many still teenagers, were expected to stay silent about mistreatment. Mike disappeared from public view, becoming synonymous with disgrace. Many of his players moved on, though some carried emotional scars from their time under his volatile leadership. Some forgave him, but others refused to speak with him again. In the following months, Mike sought help. He entered anger management, met with therapists, and began volunteering with high schools and youth sports leagues. He tried to rebuild himself and his reputation, quietly and slowly, but for many, it was far too late. The footage couldn't be erased, and the memories of his behavior couldn't be unseen. The scandal revealed what Mike was really like behind closed doors, who he truly was when no one was supposed to be watching. Mike built his career on fiery intensity, but ultimately destroyed it through cruelty. The same culture that once celebrated his passion was now responsible for his fall. In early April 2013, the footage went viral. Grainy practice clips shot inside Rutgers' basketball facility were broadcast nationwide by ESPN's Outside the Lines. Within hours, the videos were everywhere, on Twitter, Facebook, news channels, and YouTube. Almost overnight, it seemed like the entire country had seen what was never meant to be public. No narration or commentary was necessary. The footage said it all. The clips showed Mike stalking the gym floor, his face red with rage and veins bulging as he screamed insults. He hurled basketballs at players with force. One incident showed a ball bouncing off a player's head, another ricocheting off a leg. The videos captured him lunging at players, grabbing them, and shouting slurs like faggots, sissies, and motherfuckers. Every word echoed like a weapon in the gym. This was far more than intensity. It was outright abuse, and the entire world saw it, from homes to dorm rooms to break rooms across the nation. People watched the footage in disbelief. Some shook their heads in disgust. Others turned away, while some replayed the video just to reassure themselves they hadn't misinterpreted what they saw. The media responded immediately. Overnight, Mike became a national disgrace. He wasn't just a bad coach. He was that coach, the one who bullied and humiliated his players on camera. ESPN analysts dissected the video. Late-night comedians mocked him, and public figures joined in to condemn him. Famous athletes like Charles Barkley, LeBron James, and Magic Johnson weighed in. Even coaches known for their strictness and discipline agreed that Mike had crossed every line imaginable. The fallout continued at Rutgers. Within a day of the footage going public, the university was in chaos. The outcry was deafening. Students protested in the streets of New Brunswick, demanding accountability. Outraged parents called into local radio stations, furious that their children had been subjected to Mike's treatment. Alumni threatened to end their financial support of the university. The scandal had spilled far beyond the gym. It wasn't just about Mike anymore. It was about the broken culture of college sports. The phones at the president's office were ringing non-stop. Reporters set up camp outside the athletic department. Board members scrambled to hold emergency meetings. At the center of the chaos was Tim Pernetti, the athletic director who had seen the footage months earlier. but chose not to fire Mike Rice. It was soon obvious that this wasn't a case of a university blindsided by new revelations. Rutgers had already known. The video had been submitted months prior, and internal meetings had taken place. Mike had been suspended for 3 games, fined $75,000, and ordered to attend anger management. But the video itself was kept under wraps. Now, that decision seemed like a deliberate cover-up. Tim Pernetti released a public statement saying that he had always tried to do what was right. But in that case, he regretted not taking stronger action sooner. His statement did little to control the damage, but by then, the damage was done. The entire Rutgers athletic program was under intense scrutiny. Critics questioned the university's leadership, its values, and the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. Even New Jersey Governor Chris Christie weighed in, calling the video footage appalling and stating Mike should have been fired immediately. The scandal reached beyond Rutgers, prompting colleges nationwide to re-examine their policies and oversight. If such behavior could happen and be documented at Rutgers, what might be happening behind closed doors elsewhere? Meanwhile, Eric Murdoch, the whistleblower who turned in the tape, sparked mixed reactions. Some hailed him as a hero for exposing the toxic culture, while others accused him of acting out of spite after his contract wasn't renewed. Eric dismissed the accusations, saying in interviews that he hadn't done it for revenge, but because he believed it was wrong. He stated that what Mike did to those players was not how human beings should be treated. As the media frenzy slightly subsided in the weeks that followed, the consequences of the scandal continued to unfold. Former players' parents began speaking out, revealing that their sons came home emotionally drained. Some admitted they had advised their children to stay quiet, not wanting to risk losing their scholarships. Other players, like former Rutgers guard Derek Randall, shared first-hand accounts of how Mike's abusive behavior left lasting scars. Some players defended Mike, saying he pushed them to improve and wasn't a bad person. But the footage painted a stark picture. The line had been crossed, time and time again. As for Mike, he eventually broke his silence in a televised interview, admitting that he had been wrong. He said he had no excuse, that he had lost control, let his emotions take over, and let down the people he cared about most. Mike didn't try to justify his behavior or shift blame. He acknowledged that he had failed as a leader, and he said the most painful part of it all was facing his children's disappointment. Mike described his therapy sessions as the most difficult experience of his life. Week after week, he was forced to watch the tape, not as a coach, but as a father, husband, and human being. Over time, Mike Rice started volunteering with youth basketball programs. He led clinics, mentored young players, and gave speeches about emotional control and the power of words. Some viewed these actions as genuine growth, while others saw them as an attempt to repair his reputation. Regardless of intent, the scandal cast a lasting shadow. The Rutgers basketball program struggled to recover. Recruiting efforts faltered, players transferred, morale plummeted, and the university spent years working to rebuild trust with students, families, and donors alike. The NCAA, already criticized for other issues, faced renewed scrutiny over its lack of oversight and the treatment of student athletes. Lawmakers pushed for reforms aimed at protecting athletes from abusive coaching. Some schools introduced stricter reporting systems, while others quietly re-examined their own programs, hoping to avoid a similar controversy. Yet despite these reforms, one fundamental truth remained no policy. Training or code of conduct can stop abuse without individuals stepping up to confront it when they see it. The Rutgers case wasn't just about a coach losing his temper. It exposed a system that enabled and protected him while silencing those who tried to speak out. Mike didn't just betray his players. The institution failed them as well. That's why the video was so shocking. It wasn't just the disturbing footage. It was the years of silence, excuses, fear, money, and a toxic culture that allowed this behavior to thrive behind closed doors. In a televised interview, Mike issued a public apology, not to save his career, which was nearly destroyed, but to explain what had driven him to that point. He admitted that he had been out of control and that he had let his competitive drive override his values. He also confessed that he had coached through fear and anger, and that wasn't the kind of person he wanted to be. He didn't cry or plead for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. Instead, he took responsibility for his actions, acknowledging the pain he caused, especially to his players. Still, many remained skeptical. Some dismissed his remorse as calculated and insincere, a case of too little, too late. After all, how could someone who hurled slurs one year claim personal transformation the next? Former players were divided. Some privately spoke of enduring trauma, panic attacks, mistrust of authority, and memories of practices burned into their minds. Others defended Mike, arguing that he never intended harm and had helped them grow tougher and more focused. Yet even his supporters couldn't ignore the undeniable truth captured on video. This wasn't speculation. It was documented abuse. Rutgers didn't forgive him. The NCAA didn't welcome him back. No other programs reached out. His name became toxic. Parents didn't want him around their kids. Colleges avoided dealing with the questions his presence would raise. So Mike started over, not with college athletes, but with kids. He began volunteering at youth basketball camps, arriving in old sneakers and a simple t-shirt, no fancy title, no paycheck, just a whistle, a gym full of middle schoolers, and a chance to begin again with those too young to know the scandal. He taught them drills and ran warm-ups. He shared stories but also spoke about emotions, pressure, and how yelling isn't leadership. He reminded the kids that their worth wasn't tied to how many points they scored, but how they treated their teammates. Over time, some parents began to trust him with their kids. A few stayed wary, keeping their distance. But Mike wasn't asking for redemption. He just kept showing up. Back home, his wife, Kathy, stayed by his side. She had always been his voice of reason. While she didn't excuse his actions, she didn't leave him. Their family, deeply affected by the public shame, focused on healing. Their son, once teased and humiliated at school, began talking about forgiveness. Their daughter, who initially refused to watch the footage, started attending clinics again. This time, she saw her father differently, not as the man who lost control, but someone working to regain it. Still, the past lingered. In gyms or grocery stores, people sometimes recognized him. They whispered, pointed fingers, and occasionally confronted him. Some stayed silent, offering only a look that said everything. Mike didn't argue or make excuses in those moments, but acknowledged it, telling a friend that he had earned that and all he could do now was try to be better. As the years went by, the scandal faded from public attention. Headlines focused on new controversies, new scandals, and new villains. But for Mike, it never really ended. It stayed with him in therapy sessions, family dinners, and the quiet moments at kids' basketball camps between drills. He never coached college basketball again. He didn't aim for national recognition. He never even tried. Instead, he kept rebuilding, not for public opinion or media redemption, but for the people closest to him, the ones he faced every day, the ones who mattered the most. This wasn't about fixing his reputation. It was about accepting responsibility. And that is the difference between regret and true remorse. The Mike scandal didn't end with his firing. It sparked a reckoning. It forced college athletics to reevaluate the line between being a tough coach and being abusive. It revealed how some institutions prioritize image over accountability. It reminded everyone that behind every player, behind every jersey and scholarship, is a human being who deserves respect, not just discipline. Mike never returned to the college basketball stage. His name remains tied to a pivotal moment when private misconduct was dragged into public view. His story didn't fade, though. It exists in policy changes, coaching workshops, and in the tougher questions administrators now ask about what happens out of public sight. For his former players, the story leaves a personal legacy. Some carry scars, some carry lessons, but all lived through a moment that reshaped the sport and their coach. For Mike, redemption isn't a goal to achieve. It's a lifelong process of repair. The tape doesn't lie, but what a person does after the tape stops, how they take responsibility, how they change, that's the part that's harder to see. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of 4 children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, on the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniform townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose, and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice. Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's. While George's family claimed it was George's, forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center. The courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand your ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed. But the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry, Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, In that rain. The encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. The morning sky churned with an ominous darkness that seemed to mirror the storm brewing in one woman's life. Crystal McDowell had no idea that August 25, 2017 would be the last day anyone would see her alive, as Hurricane Harvey barreled toward the Texas coast. Crystal made a decision that would change everything. She left her home that Friday morning, walking into what would become one of the most baffling disappearances in recent memory. This isn't just another missing person case. This is a story where nature's fury collided with human deception, where floodwaters would wash away evidence and complicate an investigation that already had more twists than anyone could imagine. By the time the storm passed, investigators would realize they weren't just fighting against time and weather. They were up against a killer who thought the perfect storm would be the perfect cover. What you're about to hear is the complete story of Crystal McDowell's disappearance, a case that would expose the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of what appeared to be an ordinary life. 3 men would emerge as suspects. One would ultimately face justice, but the path to that courtroom would be anything but straightforward. Crystal McDowell was the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Those who knew her described a woman with an infectious spirit, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life and wasn't afraid to go after it. She had built a successful career as a flight attendant, traveling the world and embracing what friends called her gypsy soul. But by 2017, Crystal had traded the skies for real estate, diving headfirst into a new chapter of her professional life. At 43, Crystal was a mother to 2 children, 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui. She was also navigating the complexities of post-divorce life. Her marriage to Steve McDowell had officially ended just months earlier in June 2017 after 10 years together. What many described as an amicable split had left Crystal in an unusual living arrangement. She was staying in the master bedroom of the house she had helped Steve purchase, while he had moved upstairs to a different room. It was temporary, they said, just until Crystal's townhouse renovation was complete. But beneath this seemingly peaceful coexistence, there were undercurrents that few people fully understood. Crystal had recently begun dating Paul Hargrave, a local jewelry store owner. Their relationship was still new, just a few weeks old, but Crystal seemed genuinely happy. So happy, in fact, that she had posted on social media just days before her disappearance, declaring she had never been happier in her entire life. The timing of Crystal's vanishing couldn't have been worse. Hurricane Harvey was bearing down on the Texas Gulf Coast with unprecedented fury. Weather forecasters were predicting catastrophic flooding, and residents across the region were making final preparations for what would become one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. Grocery store shelves had been stripped bare. Gas stations were running dry. Everyone who could leave had already evacuated. Crystal, however, had chosen to stay. She had responsibilities, people who depended on her. As a newly licensed real estate agent, she had clients to consider. As a mother, she had children to protect. The storm was supposed to last several days, and Crystal wanted to make sure her family was safe and prepared. That Friday morning started like any other. Crystal sent text messages to Paul, her new boyfriend. They exchanged their usual good morning pleasantries, making plans for when the storm passed. But as the hours ticked by, something changed. Paul replied to Crystal's messages, but she never responded back. At first, he assumed she was simply busy preparing for the hurricane. Everyone was scrambling to secure their homes and gather supplies, but Crystal's silence was completely out of character. She was the type of person who stayed in constant communication with the people she cared about. Her Uncle Jeff, who had raised her after her parents died when she was just 11 years old, received messages from Crystal every single morning. She would check in throughout the day, sharing updates about her life, her work, her children. Jeff described his niece as one of the most responsible people he had ever known. Crystal never lost contact with her family. As Friday turned into Saturday, concern began to mount. The storm had arrived with a vengeance, dumping unprecedented amounts of rain across southeast Texas. Baytown, where Crystal lived, was taking a direct hit. Streets were flooding, power lines were down, and communication was becoming increasingly difficult. But even accounting for the chaos of the hurricane, Crystal's complete radio silence was alarming. Steve McDowell, Crystal's ex-husband, told family members that Crystal was supposed to have arrived at their house on Friday morning. He claimed she had sent him a text message at 7:01 that morning, saying she was on her way and asking if he had water. The message suggested she might stay with him and the children, since it looked like the storm would be severe. But according to Steve, Crystal never showed up. Uncle Jeff became increasingly worried as Saturday stretched into Sunday with no word from Crystal. He began reaching out to relatives and friends, trying to piece together Crystal's last known movements. That's when he learned something that made his blood run cold. Multiple people told him the same thing, they just knew something wasn't right. Crystal would never disappear without explanation, especially not when her children needed her. The timing was catastrophic from an investigative standpoint. Hurricane Harvey was wreaking havoc across the entire region. Sheriff's deputies were dealing with their own flooded homes while simultaneously trying to coordinate rescue operations. Some investigators had lost everything they owned to the storm, yet they still showed up for work every single day, determined to find Crystal McDowell. District Attorney Cheryl Leak would later describe the challenges they faced. The flooding was so severe that normal investigative procedures became nearly impossible. Crime scene labs were underwater, evidence collection was compromised, transportation was limited. But despite these overwhelming obstacles, law enforcement remained committed to finding Crystal. They understood something that Crystal's family already knew. Mothers don't just disappear, especially not during natural disasters when their children need them most. As the floodwaters began to recede, investigators started to piece together a timeline of Crystal's final days. What they discovered painted a picture of a woman who was genuinely excited about her future. She had been making plans with Paul to travel to Europe. She had invited him to join her family on an upcoming cruise. Though there was one complication, her ex-husband Steve was also supposed to be on that cruise. This detail would prove to be more significant than anyone initially realized. Paul had expressed concern about the awkwardness of joining a family vacation that included Crystal's ex-husband. He had asked Crystal if Steve could perhaps skip the trip. According to Paul, Crystal had approached Steve about not attending the cruise, and Steve's reaction had been intense. He was visibly upset about being excluded from what he had apparently viewed as an opportunity to reconcile with Crystal. The investigation was further complicated by Crystal's extensive social circle. As a former flight attendant and current real estate agent, she knew people all across Texas and beyond. She was described as extremely social, someone who maintained friendships from every chapter of her life. This meant that investigators had dozens of potential witnesses to interview, relationships to explore, and alibis to verify. 3 men quickly emerged as persons of interest in Crystal's disappearance. There was Steve McDowell, the ex-husband who still shared a home with Crystal and seemed to harbor hopes of reconciliation. There was Paul Hargrave, the new boyfriend who had been one of the last people to see Crystal alive. And somewhat surprisingly, there was Uncle Jeff himself, whose emotional involvement in the case and tendency to interfere with the investigation had begun to raise questions among law enforcement. Each of these men had a different story about Crystal's final hours. Each claimed to want nothing more than to see her returned safely. But as investigators would soon discover, the truth was far more complicated than any of them were willing to admit. The discovery of Crystal's abandoned Mercedes in a motel parking lot would mark the beginning of the end of this tragic mystery. The discovery came from an unexpected source. While law enforcement was struggling against flooded roads and damaged communication systems, Crystal's own family and friends had organized their own search efforts. They knew the areas Crystal frequented, understood her habits and routines in ways that even the most dedicated investigators couldn't match. It was this intimate knowledge that led them to the breakthrough everyone had been hoping for. Crystal's black Mercedes was found sitting in the parking lot of a Motel 6, its doors unlocked, and keys resting conspicuously on the center console. Sheriff Hawthorne arrived at the scene and immediately knew something was wrong. In his years of law enforcement experience, he had never encountered an abandoned vehicle staged so obviously. Everything about the scene screamed setup. The car's placement seemed almost theatrical. It was positioned in plain sight, as if someone wanted it to be discovered. But whoever had left it there hadn't anticipated the massive flooding that Harvey would bring. The rising waters had trapped the Mercedes in the parking lot, making it impossible for anyone to drive it away. What had likely been planned as a temporary hiding spot had become a permanent crime scene. Processing the vehicle presented unique challenges. The flood damage had contaminated potential evidence, and the crime lab facilities in Houston were dealing with their own hurricane-related problems. Many of the technicians and analysts had lost their homes to the storm, yet they continued working around the clock to help solve this case. The dedication was remarkable, but the practical limitations were undeniable. Sheriff's deputies began canvassing nearby businesses, hoping to find security cameras that might have captured whoever had abandoned Crystal's car. The investigation was painstaking work made even more difficult by the storm's aftermath. Many businesses had suffered flood damage, and their surveillance systems were offline. But investigators persevered, checking every possible angle. Their persistence paid off when they discovered footage from a Shell gas station adjacent to the motel. The grainy video showed a figure emerging from what appeared to be Crystal's Mercedes and walking to a nearby trash receptacle. The person seemed to be disposing of something, pushing it deep into the container with deliberate force. Even more telling was the way this individual kept glancing toward the motel, as if checking to ensure the car was still where it had been left. The footage was far from perfect, but experienced investigators could make out enough details to identify the person as Steve McDowell. This was the first concrete evidence linking Crystal's ex-husband to her disappearance, and it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Additional surveillance footage from the motel's own cameras showed someone parking Crystal's car and walking away. Again, the figure bore a strong resemblance to Steve McDowell. For investigators who had been working with limited physical evidence, these videos represented a major breakthrough. They finally had something concrete to work with, but Steve wasn't making things easy for law enforcement. When brought in for questioning, he maintained his story that Crystal had never arrived at his house that Friday morning. He insisted he had no idea what had happened to her and volunteered to help with the investigation in any way possible. His demeanor was cooperative, even friendly, but investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account. Polygraph tests were administered to both Steve and Paul Hargrave, The results were revealing. While Paul's test results were inconclusive, Steve failed his examination decisively. When confronted with these results, Steve's attorney advised him to stop cooperating with the investigation. The friendly, helpful ex-husband suddenly became evasive and defensive. Meanwhile, investigators were learning more about the dynamics of Crystal and Steve's relationship. What had been described as an amicable divorce was actually far more complicated. Family members revealed that Steve had never truly accepted the end of their marriage. He harbored fantasies about reconciliation and had been devastated when Crystal began dating someone else. Crystal's Aunt Cindy provided crucial insights into Steve's behavior. She described how he would cater to Crystal's every need, rubbing her feet when she was tired, brushing her hair when she asked. His devotion bordered on obsession, and Crystal's independence had been gradually eroding under the weight of his neediness. When Crystal finally decided to end their marriage, Steve's world had collapsed. The upcoming family cruise had taken on enormous significance in Steve's mind. He had apparently purchased matching white outfits for himself and Crystal, planning to propose to her during the trip. In his fantasy, they would remarry and start fresh. When Crystal uninvited him from the cruise to make room for her new boyfriend, it shattered his delusions about their future together. Financial pressures were also mounting in Steve's life. Crystal had been his primary source of financial support, and she had recently decided to cut him off. Friends described how Steve had been spending money recklessly, making purchases he couldn't afford, while Crystal covered his expenses. When she finally said she couldn't continue supporting his lifestyle, Steve faced the loss of not just his ex-wife, but his entire way of life. The investigation took another crucial turn when deputies discovered additional surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart. This video showed Steve purchasing a bicycle on the day Crystal disappeared. The timing was significant because it provided a potential explanation for how Steve had gotten home after abandoning Crystal's car at the motel. The bicycle purchase occurred after Crystal's Mercedes had been spotted at the motel, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous act. Investigators were building a compelling circumstantial case, but they still lacked the direct evidence needed to make an arrest. Steve seemed to understand this, growing more confident and arrogant with each passing day. He would arrive at the sheriff's office for questioning and sit for hours, calmly denying any involvement in Crystal's disappearance. His attitude suggested he believed he was untouchable. The psychological pressure was mounting on all sides. District Attorney Cheryl Leek knew Steve was guilty, but struggled with the knowledge that knowing something and proving it in court were two very different challenges. The case was consuming enormous resources, and the community was demanding answers. Meanwhile, Steve retained custody of his and Crystal's two young children, a situation that made everyone uncomfortable. The breakthrough came when investigators realized they needed to apply different pressure to Steve. Rather than continuing to focus solely on gathering evidence, they decided to remove the children from his care. Working with Family Protective Services, they arranged for Madden and Maui to be placed with Crystal's Aunt Cindy. The psychological impact on Steve was immediate and devastating. Losing custody of the children represented Steve's final connection to his old life. Without Crystal and without the kids, he had nothing left to lose. Investigators hoped this realization would finally break through his defenses and lead to a confession. They were betting everything on the theory that a man with nothing left to protect might finally tell the truth. The gamble was risky. If Steve decided to run or harm himself, they would lose their only real suspect and any chance of finding Crystal's body. But Sheriff Hawthorne made the difficult decision to allow Steve to go home one final time, giving him the night to consider his options. It was an unprecedented move that would either solve the case or let a killer escape justice forever. The night Steve spent at home would prove to be his last as a free man. Early the next morning, he called his daughter Krista, who was attending Texas A&M University, asking her to come home immediately. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable. When Krista arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, she found her father in a state she had never seen before. Steve was methodical that morning, almost businesslike as he handed over photo albums, financial documents, and even the keys to his prized Mustang to Krista. It seemed like her father was simply trying to get his affairs in order before facing whatever consequences awaited him. She had defended him throughout the investigation, believing completely in his innocence. But then the conversation took a chilling turn. Steve looked at his daughter and said something that would haunt her forever. He mentioned that investigators had told him they would reduce his punishment if he revealed where Crystal's body was located. When Krista protested that he couldn't possibly know such information, Steve's response was devastating. He looked away and broke down completely. In that moment, Krista realized the horrible truth. Her father knew exactly where Crystal McDowell was because he had put her there. The man she had defended, the father she had loved and trusted, was a killer. When police arrived to take Steve into custody, Krista collapsed to her knees and wept. At the sheriff's office, Steve finally began to talk. The confession came slowly, painfully, but it came nonetheless. He described how Crystal had returned home that Friday morning after spending the night with Paul. An argument had erupted immediately. Steve was furious that she had stayed out all night, devastated by her obvious happiness with another man. In his statement, Steve claimed that Crystal had become aggressive during their confrontation. He said she didn't love him anymore, that she had made that abundantly clear. But investigators believed the truth was simpler and more sinister. Steve McDowell had made a calculated decision. If he couldn't have Crystal, nobody could. The details Steve provided were horrific. He described strangling Crystal from behind, catching her completely off guard. She had no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to fight back. After killing the mother of his children, Steve had methodically disposed of her body, wrapping it in trash bags before driving to a remote wooded area. Steve led investigators to the location where he had dumped Crystal's remains. The site was densely wooded and difficult to access, chosen specifically because Steve believed it would never be discovered. Recovery efforts were complicated by the thick vegetation and the decomposition that had occurred during the weeks since Crystal's murder. When Crystal's body was finally recovered, the case officially became a homicide prosecution. Steve McDowell was arrested and charged with murder, ending months of speculation and bringing some measure of closure to Crystal's devastated family. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of Steve's deception and obsession. Despite his confession, he attempted to claim that Crystal's death had been accidental, the result of what he described as a spontaneous embrace that had gotten out of control. The jury didn't believe him. After 5 days of testimony and evidence, it took the jury less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. Steve McDowell was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 50 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2042 when he is in his 70s. The tragedy extended far beyond Crystal's death. 2 young children had lost both parents, their mother to murder, their father to prison. 8-year-old Madden and 5-year-old Maui would grow up knowing the devastating truth about how their family had been destroyed. Crystal McDowell's story serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence can lurk behind the facade of even the most seemingly normal relationships. Her death occurred during one of the most catastrophic natural disasters in American history. But the real storm had been brewing in her own home for years. Hurricane Harvey eventually passed, leaving behind billions of dollars in damage and forever changing the Texas Gulf Coast. But for Crystal's family and friends, the storm's most devastating casualty was a vibrant woman whose only crime was trying to build a new life for herself and her children. Today, Crystal's children are thriving under the care of family friends who have provided them with the stability and love they deserve. They carry their mother's memory with them, remembering her infectious spirit and her determination to always do what was right. This case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers who refused to give up, even when facing seemingly impossible circumstances. Despite flooded crime labs, damaged evidence, and personal losses from the hurricane, they persevered until justice was served. Crystal McDowell's story didn't end with Hurricane Harvey, but her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the children she loved more than anything in the world. In 1979, on what seemed like a perfect summer evening, a 9-year-old girl's life changed forever. One moment she was watching television and laughing at a comedy show. The next, she was learning that someone wanted her entire family dead. This is the story of the Busby family, whose year of terror began with a single shotgun blast that shattered more than just a car window. It destroyed their sense of safety, their home, and forced them into a life they never imagined possible. Picture this. It's August 31st, 1979, the Friday before Labor Day weekend. The Busby family is spending their evening in the driveway, painting a car while the summer sun sets over Cape Cod. 9-year-old Silen Busby has no idea this will be the last normal moment of her childhood. Her father, John Busby, is getting ready for his midnight shift as a police sergeant in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Everything seems ordinary, peaceful even, but in small towns like Falmouth, ordinary can become extraordinary in the span of a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat stops altogether. John Busby wasn't just any police officer. He was the kind of cop who didn't care about your connections, your family name, or how much money you had. If you broke the law, you faced the consequences, period. This unwavering commitment to justice had earned him respect from honest citizens and hatred from those who thought they were above the law. Unfortunately for the Busby family, one of those people had decided that John Busby needed to be silenced permanently. As John drove to work that night, less than half a mile from his house, a car pulled up behind him. At first, it seemed like any other vehicle on the road, but then it pulled alongside his Volkswagen, matching his speed. In that moment, John realized this wasn't a normal traffic situation. Someone was hunting him. The blast from the shotgun tore through the driver's side window with devastating force. The impact ripped through John's face, destroying his lower jaw and leaving him barely conscious. But in those crucial seconds before darkness took hold, he managed to do something that would save his family's lives. He wrote 2 words that would change everything, not an accident. John Busby knew instantly who wanted him dead. He'd crossed paths with dangerous people before, but one name stood out above all others. Someone who had a reputation for making problems disappear, sometimes along with the people who caused them. Someone who had been suspected in multiple disappearances and murders but had never been held accountable. Someone whose favorite saying was, "I smell smoke," which wasn't a comment about the weather, but a thinly veiled threat that your property might mysteriously catch fire. Meanwhile, back at the Busby house, 9-year-old Silen was settling in for what she thought would be a normal evening. She was watching Benny Hill on television, laughing at the comedy sketches, completely unaware that her father was fighting for his life just minutes away. Her mother, Polly, was studying to become a nurse. Her two older brothers, Eric and Sean, were probably getting ready for bed. Their cousin Kelly, who helped with babysitting duties, was keeping an eye on things. Then came the knock at the door that shattered their world. When Silent heard someone crying or screaming, she initially thought it was coming from the television. But as the sounds continued, she realized something was terribly wrong. She came out of her room to find her father's colleague, Rick Smith, in uniform, speaking to her mother, who was crying and screaming, repeatedly saying no, 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 and trying to push him away. The confusion was overwhelming. Nobody was explaining what had happened. There was just chaos, fear, and the terrible realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Silent stood there, asking what was happening. But the adults were too consumed by their own shock and panic to notice her. What Silent didn't know yet was that her father was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, unable to breathe on his own, but very much alive and very much aware of who had tried to kill him. What she also didn't know was that this shooting wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge certain people in their small town. And if those people were willing to shoot a police officer, they certainly wouldn't hesitate to finish the job by eliminating his family. The note John managed to write in his hospital bed contained more than just the words, "Not an accident." He also wrote, "Polly and the kids are not safe." This wasn't the rambling of a man in shock. This was the clear, calculated warning of someone who understood exactly what kind of enemy they were dealing with. In Falmouth, Massachusetts, there was one person everyone knew you didn't cross. Melvin Rain was in the trash hauling business, which might sound harmless enough, but his methods of dealing with competition and problems were anything but ordinary. He was a convicted arsonist with a reputation for getting even with people by sneaking around at night and burning their property, houses, cars, businesses. If Melvin had a problem with you, something you owned might mysteriously go up in flames, but arson was just the beginning. Melvin was also suspected of murder. Not one murder, not two, but 3 separate cases where people had disappeared or turned up dead under suspicious circumstances. His own wife, Wanda, had vanished in 1971 after he claimed to have dropped her off at a bus station. She was never seen again. A teenage boy who had been dating a girl Melvin was interested in was found shot to death in a cranberry bog directly across from Melvin's house. A 17-year-old former employee who was set to testify against Melvin in a grand jury investigation got on a ferry to Martha's Vineyard but never got off. In each case, Melvin walked free. The pattern was always the same. People who crossed him or posed a threat to him seemed to disappear or meet unfortunate ends. But there was never enough evidence to charge him. Or perhaps there were people in positions of power who were too afraid to go after him. This was the man John Busby had been willing to confront when others wouldn't. This was the man who had decided that a police officer who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated needed to be eliminated. And this was the man who now posed an ongoing threat to a family that included 3 young children. Back at the hospital, doctors were working frantically to save John's life. The damage was so severe that they had never seen anything like it. His face was unrecognizable. His jaw was gone, and he couldn't speak, breathe, or eat without mechanical assistance. But he was alive, and he was determined to stay that way for one reason: his family needed him to survive so he could protect them from what was coming next. Because this story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As the Busby family tried to process what had happened, the reality of their situation began to sink in. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone had specifically targeted John Busby for elimination, and that same someone would likely not be satisfied with a failed attempt. The police response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the shooting, the Busby house was surrounded by law enforcement. Squad cars filled the driveway. Officers with rifles took positions around the property. The message was clear. This family was now under siege, and everyone understood that the danger was far from over. For 9-year-old Silen, the transformation was jarring. One day, she was a normal kid living in a normal house on Cape Cod. The next day, armed guards were stationed outside her bedroom window. Police officers followed her to school, sat outside her classroom, and watched her eat lunch. Every movement was monitored. Every person who came near her was scrutinized. The psychological impact on the children was immediate and profound. At school, word spread quickly about what had happened. Some children were curious, others were frightened, and many were simply told by their parents to stay away from the Busby kids. Silen found herself sitting alone at lunch tables, excluded from playground games, and treated like a walking target. One particularly cruel classmate even told her directly that everyone knew someone was trying to kill her family and that they might be next. The family's home became a fortress. An 8-foot fence was erected around the property. A sophisticated alarm system was installed. Windows were covered. Doors remained locked at all times. The family dog, Tiger, was given away and replaced with Max, a trained attack dog whose sole purpose was to eliminate any threat to John Busby or his family. Max wasn't a pet. He was a weapon with 4 legs and a set of teeth designed to kill. But perhaps the most unsettling change was in John himself. When he finally came home from the hospital months later, he was a different person entirely. The injuries to his face were so severe that he was barely recognizable. His jaw had been reconstructed, but the damage went far beyond the physical. The man who had once been playful and affectionate with his children now seemed emotionally distant. The father who used to roughhouse and tell jokes had been replaced by someone who was constantly vigilant, always watching, always planning. The financial burden on the family was crushing. John's compensation for being shot in the line of duty was $200 per week, hardly enough to support a family of 5, let alone a family that needed round-the-clock security. The town of Falmouth was spending enormous amounts of money on police protection, and it was becoming clear that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Meanwhile, the investigation into the shooting was going nowhere. Despite John's clear indication of who was responsible, despite the obvious motive, and despite Melvin Rain's history of violence, no arrests were made, no charges were filed, no justice was served. It was as if the shooting had never happened, at least from an official standpoint. This lack of action wasn't just frustrating, it was terrifying. If the police couldn't or wouldn't go after the person who had tried to murder one of their own officers, what protection could they really offer his family? The Busbys were living in a state of constant fear, never knowing when the next attempt on their lives might come. John's anger was building to dangerous levels. In his hospital bed, he had initially focused on survival and recovery. But as the months passed and it became clear that no official justice would be forthcoming, his thoughts turned to a different kind of solution. He began to contemplate taking matters into his own hands. The idea of hunting down Melvin Rain and finishing what had been started that night in August became more than just a fantasy. It became a plan. The family was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. They couldn't live normally because of the constant threat. They couldn't rely on the justice system because it had failed them completely. They couldn't even trust their own community because too many people were either afraid of Melvin Rain or somehow connected to him. As winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, it became increasingly clear that something had to change. The Busby family couldn't continue living as prisoners in their own home. The town couldn't continue spending money on protection that might not even be effective. And John couldn't continue to heal, physically or emotionally, while surrounded by daily reminders of the violence that had been done to him. The solution, when it finally came, was as drastic as it was necessary. If the Busby family couldn't be safe in Falmouth, Massachusetts, then they would have to leave Falmouth, Massachusetts, not just for a vacation or a temporary relocation, but permanently. They would have to disappear completely, leaving behind everything they had ever known and starting over somewhere new, somewhere safe, somewhere that Melvin Rain couldn't find them. But leaving meant more than just packing their belongings and driving away. It meant abandoning their identities, their history, their connections to the community where they had lived their entire lives. It meant the children would have to learn to lie about their past, create false stories about why they had moved, and never speak the truth about what had happened to their father. Most importantly, it meant that John Busby would have to make a choice. He could stay and pursue the violent revenge that was consuming his thoughts, or he could prioritize his family's safety and disappear with them into whatever new life awaited them far from Cape Cod. The decision would define not just the next chapter of their story, but the rest of their lives. In the end, the choice was made for them. The town of Falmouth, faced with mounting security costs and no resolution in sight, made it clear that the easiest solution was for the Busby family to simply disappear, rather than continue the expensive protection detail or pursue justice against the person responsible. It was more convenient for everyone involved if the victims just went away. The message was unmistakable. It's easier for you to live somewhere else than to live here. We'll save money, and you'll be on your way. After everything John had sacrificed in service to his community, after taking a shotgun blast to the face in the line of duty, this was his reward. The town that he had protected was essentially telling him that his family's safety was less important than their budget. So in the summer of 1980, almost exactly 1 year after the shooting, the Busby family began their exodus from Cape Cod. They loaded their belongings into a car and started driving south, with no clear destination except somewhere safe. They had pulled the names of towns out of a hat, places where Polly might find work as a nurse, and Tennessee had won the lottery of their desperation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. They were given a police escort to the Bourne Bridge, the boundary that separates Cape Cod from the mainland. It was both a gesture of respect and a clear message, goodbye and good riddance. You're not our problem anymore, as they crossed that bridge, leaving behind everything they had ever known. The children understood that they weren't just moving to a new town. They were entering a witness protection program of their own design, one where they would have to reinvent themselves completely. The people they had been, the Busby family of Falmouth, Massachusetts, were disappearing forever. The drive south felt like descending into hell. As they traveled further from the familiar coastline of Cape Cod, the temperature rose and the landscape became increasingly foreign. For children who had grown up with ocean breezes and familiar neighborhoods, the rural expanses of the American South felt like exile to another planet. When they finally reached their destination in Tennessee, the culture shock was immediate and overwhelming. Everything was different. The accents, the food, the social customs, even the way people looked at strangers. The Busby children, with their New England sensibilities and traumatic baggage, stood out like beacons in their new community. But standing out was exactly what they couldn't afford to do. So they began the painful process of transformation. Silen got a perm and started practicing a Southern accent. She learned to apply lip gloss and dress like the local girls. Most importantly, she learned to lie about their past, about why they had moved, about what was wrong with her father's face, about everything that mattered. John grew a massive beard that obscured most of the damage to his face. He found work on a farm, spending his days splitting wood and doing physical labor that seemed to help process some of his rage. The repetitive motion of swinging an axe through logs became a form of therapy, a way to channel the violence that still simmered inside him. For a while, it seemed like the healing might actually work. The family began to find their rhythm in this new place. The constant fear that had defined their existence in Massachusetts gradually faded. The children started making friends. Polly found work as a nurse. They were still looking over their shoulders, still careful about who they trusted. But life began to feel somewhat normal again. But John's anger hadn't disappeared. It had just gone underground. Every few months, he would have to return to Boston for reconstructive surgery, and each trip forced him to confront what had been done to him. When he shaved his beard for these procedures, he would see the full extent of his injuries in the mirror, and the rage would come flooding back. During one of these trips, his uncle presented him with a gift, a rifle with a scope and a silencer, everything he would need to hunt down Melvin Rain and finish what had been started that night in 1979. For a moment, John was tempted. The weapon represented everything he had dreamed about during those dark months of recovery. But something had changed. The man who had once fantasized about revenge had been replaced by someone who understood that his family's peace was worth more than his personal vengeance. He looked at the gun, wrote a note to his uncle, and walked away. "Thank you for your effort," he wrote. "I won't need it." That decision marked a turning point. When John returned to Tennessee, he told his family he was done with surgery, done with trips to Boston, done with living in the past. They were going to embrace their new life and move forward as the people they had become, not the people they used to be. Years passed. The children grew up, went to college, started families of their own. The trauma never fully disappeared, but it became manageable. The family had survived not just the original attack, but the year of terror that followed and the complete upheaval of their lives. Then, in 2003, 24 years after the shooting, something unexpected happened. The Rain family had started turning on each other, fighting over money and spilling family secrets to the police. John Rain, Melvin's brother, finally came clean about what had happened that night in August 1979. The confession provided the vindication that John Busby had been seeking for more than 2 decades. His instincts had been correct. Melvin Rain had indeed been the one who ordered the hit. John Rain described how his brother had sat in the back seat of their car with a ski mask and a shotgun, waiting for the perfect moment to fire through John's window. But vindication came with a bitter irony. By the time the confession was made, the statute of limitations had expired. No charges could be filed. No justice could be served through the legal system. Melvin Rain would never face trial for attempted murder. In a way, though, justice had been served by other means. Melvin Rain was confined to a state institution, suffering from what was reported to be Pick's disease, a form of dementia that affects the brain. The man who had once terrorized an entire community was now powerless, his mind deteriorating, his capacity for violence neutralized by his own failing health. For the Busby family, the confession brought closure of a different kind. They had built new lives far from Cape Cod. lives that were fuller and richer than what they had left behind. Silin became a successful author, writing books for children and drawing on her experiences to help others understand resilience and survival. John and Polly found peace in their rural Tennessee home, surrounded by the natural beauty that had helped heal their wounds. The year they disappeared had ended, but the people they became in its aftermath had endured. They had proven that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about finding ways to thrive despite the worst that life can throw at you. They had learned that sometimes running away isn't cowardice. It's the bravest thing you can do to protect the people you love. Looking back, Silin would say that she couldn't imagine being anyone other than who that terrible year had made her. The trauma had touched every part of her life, but it had also given her strength, perspective, and an appreciation for safety and normalcy that most people never develop. She had lived through something that should have destroyed her family, and instead, it had ultimately made them stronger. The Busby family's story is a testament to the power of choosing life over revenge, healing over hatred, and love over fear. They disappeared from one life and created another, proving that sometimes the best way to defeat your enemies is simply to refuse to let them define your future. In the end, they had won, not through violence or legal justice, but through the simple act of surviving and building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The year they disappeared had become the foundation for decades of peace, love, and happiness that followed. And perhaps that's the most powerful victory of all. The alarm went off at 5:15 in the morning, just like it had every single day for years. But on March 1st, 2019, the bed where Andreen McDonald should have been stirring was already empty. Her husband Andre claimed he had no idea where she was, within hours. What started as a simple welfare check would transform into one of San Antonio's most disturbing criminal cases. A successful businesswoman had vanished without a trace from her gated community home, leaving behind a trail of blood, a mysterious burn pile, and a husband whose story kept changing. Good morning, and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into a case that shattered the American dream and exposed the dark secrets lurking behind a picture-perfect marriage. This is the story of Andreen McDonald, a millionaire who disappeared in the middle of the night, and the investigation that would reveal just how far someone might go to destroy the life they helped create. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because cases like this one require multiple parts to tell the full story. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let me paint you a picture of what success looked like in San Antonio's upscale neighborhoods. Andreen McDonald was living proof that the American dream was still achievable if you had the drive and determination to make it happen. At just 29 years old, this Jamaican immigrant had built something extraordinary from absolutely nothing. Picture this: a young woman arriving in America with little more than hope and ambition, meeting an Air Force officer who believed in her vision, and together building a multi-million-dollar empire. That's exactly what Andreen accomplished when she founded Starlight Homes, an assisted living business that started with just 3 residents in her own home and grew into a thriving enterprise with multiple locations across the San Antonio area. But here's what made Andreen different from your typical successful entrepreneur. She wasn't just about the money or the status. This woman had a routine that would put military personnel to shame. Every single morning, 5:30 sharp, she'd be at the gym. No excuses, no exceptions. By 8 o'clock, she'd be in her office, ready to tackle whatever challenges the day might bring. Her employees knew they could set their watches by her arrival. Her dedication wasn't just impressive, it was legendary. This wasn't someone who took days off on a whim or disappeared without explanation. Andréane MacDonald was the definition of reliability. So when March 1st rolled around and Andréane didn't show up for work, alarm bells should have been ringing immediately. But sometimes the people closest to us are the last to recognize when something's terribly wrong. The call came in from her mother, Maureen, who had been trying to reach her daughter all morning. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. For a woman who was in constant communication with her family and business partners, this silence was deafening. When Bexar County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the MacDonald residence in their gated community, they expected to find a simple explanation. Maybe Andréane had gotten sick and was sleeping off a migraine. Maybe there had been a family emergency that required her immediate attention. What they definitely didn't expect to find was evidence of violence. The house itself told a story that nobody wanted to read. On the surface, everything looked normal. The furniture was in place, nothing appeared to be stolen, and there were no obvious signs of a break-in. But when you looked closer, when you knew what to look for, the details became chilling. There was blood on the bathroom wall. Not a lot, but enough to catch a trained investigator's eye. Mixed in with that blood were strands of hair, and outside in the backyard, where Andréane had once maintained a beautiful garden, there was now a burn pile that hadn't been there before. Now, let's talk about André MacDonald for a moment. This wasn't some random stranger who had wandered into their lives. This was Andréane's husband of several years, a major in the United States Air Force with top-secret security clearance. This was the man who had brought Andréane to America in the first place, who had liquidated his own retirement fund to help her start her business, who had been by her side as they built their fortune together. When deputies questioned André about his wife's whereabouts, his story seemed straightforward enough. He claimed that he had woken up that morning, gotten their young daughter Elena ready for school, and headed off to his duties at Lackland Air Force Base, where he worked as a cyber warfare analyst. Just another routine day in what appeared to be a routine marriage. But here's where things get interesting. André told investigators that when he learned his wife was missing, his first instinct was to check the local hospitals. He had a hunch. He said that maybe Andréane had suffered one of her severe migraines and had driven herself to get medical treatment. The surveillance cameras at the hospital captured André arriving and asking about a patient named MacDonald. The staff directed him to room 3, where indeed there was a MacDonald receiving treatment. André seemed relieved as he headed back home to share the good news with the deputies who were waiting for him. Except there was one problem. When the deputies called the hospital to verify André's story, they discovered that the MacDonald in room 3 wasn't Andréane MacDonald at all. It was a completely different person who just happened to share the same last name. So now we have to ask ourselves, was this an honest mistake made by a worried husband? Or was this the first crack in a carefully constructed lie? André's explanation was that he had rushed back home before actually confirming his wife's identity because he had forgotten his cell phone and wanted to call Andréane's mother to share the good news. He claimed there had been some indication that his wife was injured and receiving treatment, but unfortunately, his hunch had turned out to be wrong. But investigators were starting to notice patterns that didn't quite add up. While André appeared to be cooperative on the surface, there were inconsistencies in his timeline and gaps in his story that raised red flags. The more they dug into the MacDonald marriage, the more complex the picture became. From the outside, Andrei and Andrean appeared to be the perfect power couple. He was the decorated military officer with his steady government salary and security clearance. She was the entrepreneurial dynamo who had transformed a small home-based business into a multi-million-dollar operation. Friends described them as being deeply in love, always laughing together, constantly supporting each other's dreams and ambitions. Andrei had sacrificed financially to help Andrean get her business off the ground, selling his BMW and cashing in his retirement savings to give her the capital she needed. And for a while, it seemed like that sacrifice had paid off beautifully. Starlight Homes wasn't just successful, it was thriving beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Within 7 years, what had started as a small operation caring for 3 elderly residents had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that employed dozens of people and served the San Antonio community. Andrean herself had become something of a local celebrity in the assisted living industry. She was known for her hands-on approach, her genuine care for the residents in her facilities, and her commitment to providing quality care for some of society's most vulnerable members. But success, as many of us know, can be a double-edged sword. The same drive and ambition that had made Andrean so successful in business had also made her the primary breadwinner in the McDonald household. While Andrei had his military salary, it was Andrean's business acumen that had generated the real wealth in their family. And sometimes, when the traditional gender roles in a marriage get flipped, when the wife becomes more financially successful than the husband, it can create tensions that aren't immediately visible to the outside world. As investigators continued their initial examination of the McDonald home, they began to uncover evidence that suggested the picture-perfect marriage might not have been quite so perfect after all. The blood and hair in the bathroom were concerning enough, but there were other clues that painted a more troubling picture. The burn pile in the backyard wasn't just random debris. When crime scene technicians sifted through the ashes, they found something that made everyone's blood run cold: the zipper from one of Andrean's blouses. The fabric had been completely consumed by flames, but metal doesn't burn as easily as cloth. This wasn't someone disposing of old yard waste or having a casual bonfire. This was someone trying to destroy evidence, trying to eliminate any trace of what had happened in that house on the night of February 28th and the early morning hours of March 1st. But if Andrei McDonald thought he had covered his tracks, he was about to learn just how difficult it is to make someone disappear completely in the modern world. Every purchase leaves a paper trail. Every movement can be captured by surveillance cameras. Every lie can be exposed by forensic science. The investigation was just getting started, and the secrets that the McDonald marriage had been hiding were about to be dragged into the harsh light of day. Because when a millionaire vanishes from her own home, leaving behind nothing but blood and ashes, someone has to answer for what happened in those final moments. And Andrei McDonald was about to discover that his story had more holes than he'd realized. The reality of modern investigations is that secrets don't stay buried for long. Within days of Andrean's disappearance, investigators had uncovered a web of deception that stretched far beyond that blood-stained bathroom and mysterious burn pile. Andrei McDonald's cooperation with law enforcement came to an abrupt halt when he realized the questions weren't going to stop with simple explanations. On March 2nd, less than 24 hours after his wife was reported missing, Andrei made a decision that spoke volumes about his state of mind. He stopped talking to investigators and immediately hired a lawyer. Now, you might think that's just smart legal strategy. After all, innocent people have the right to legal representation too. But when your spouse is missing and every hour counts in terms of finding them alive, choosing to lawyer up instead of helping with the search sends a pretty clear message to investigators. What happened next was like watching a man unravel in real time. While law enforcement continued processing the crime scene and searching for any trace of André, they assigned an undercover investigator to keep tabs on André's movements. And what they observed over the next few days would convince them that they weren't dealing with a grieving husband anymore. On March 2nd, that undercover investigator noticed something strange. The garage at the McDonald residence had been damaged somehow, and André was backing his vehicle out of the driveway with what appeared to be urgent purpose. The investigator followed at a distance, wondering where André might be headed during one of the most critical periods in the search for his missing wife. The destination was chilling in its implications. André drove straight to a local gun shop, where surveillance cameras captured him purchasing a 9mm handgun and ammunition. Think about that for a moment. While search teams were combing through wooded areas and volunteers were posting missing person flyers around San Antonio, André McDonald was buying a weapon. Investigators had to make a split-second decision about what this purchase might mean. Was André planning to harm himself? Was he planning to harm someone else? Or was there something even more sinister at play? They couldn't take any chances. As André walked back toward his car, investigators moved in and took him down in what can only be described as a violent confrontation. The man who had been portraying himself as a concerned husband was suddenly face down on the asphalt, being detained by the very people who were supposed to be helping him find his wife. André was immediately turned over to military authorities for a psychological evaluation, but investigators weren't done with their search of his property. Armed with a search warrant, they returned to the McDonald residence and began examining André's vehicle more thoroughly. What they found in that car was like a shopping list for body disposal: a shovel, an axe, a hatchet, trash bags, gloves, multiple gas cans. These weren't tools you'd need for regular home maintenance or yard work. These were items specifically chosen for a much darker purpose. But the real bombshell was waiting inside the family's garbage can. Hidden among the regular household refuse, investigators found a receipt from Lowe's hardware store. The receipt was torn up, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but hadn't quite finished the job. When they pieced it together, the items listed matched exactly what they had found in André's car. The timestamp on that receipt was crucial. These items had been purchased on March 2nd, the day after Andréan went missing. While her family was frantically searching for any sign of her, while volunteers were organizing search parties, André McDonald had been shopping for tools to dispose of a body. Security footage from the Lowe's store showed André methodically selecting each item. A shovel went into his cart. 2 gas cans followed, then a maul and an axe. The man on that surveillance video wasn't behaving like someone whose wife had mysteriously vanished. He was behaving like someone who knew exactly where she was and what needed to be done to keep anyone else from finding her. In the corner of the McDonald garage, investigators made their most damning discovery yet: a claw hammer, stained with what laboratory tests would later confirm was André's blood. Nearby, they found clothing that belonged to André, also bearing traces of his wife's blood. For Detective Frank Stubbs, this evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened in the McDonald home during the early morning hours of March 1st. The hammer had been used as a weapon. The blood evidence showed that André had been attacked in her own home. And André's subsequent shopping trip proved that he had spent the hours after her disappearance preparing to cover up his crime. But here's the challenge that investigators faced: having evidence of a crime and being able to prove exactly what happened are 2 completely different things. Despite all the blood evidence, despite the suspicious purchases, despite André's changing story and refusal to cooperate, they still didn't have Andréan's body. Turning a missing persons case into a homicide prosecution is incredibly difficult without a victim. Prosecutors need to be able to prove not just that someone died, but how they died, when they died, and who was responsible for their death. And all of that becomes exponentially harder when the primary evidence is missing. On March 3rd, after the Air Force completed its psychological evaluation and determined that Andre wasn't an immediate danger to himself, civil authorities moved quickly to arrest him, but they couldn't charge him with murder. Not yet. Instead, Andre McDonald was arrested for tampering with evidence. Based on that torn receipt and the tools found in his possession, the arrest sent shockwaves through the San Antonio community and devastated both sides of the McDonald family. Andre's mother, Jackie, was in complete disbelief. This was her son, a decorated military officer, someone she had raised to be responsible and honorable. The idea that he could harm anyone, let alone his own wife, seemed impossible to accept. Andre's family was struggling with their own conflicting emotions. On one hand, they wanted justice for what they believed had happened to their daughter and sister. On the other hand, they were dealing with the horrible reality that the man they had welcomed into their family, the man who had brought Andrian to America and helped her build her dreams, might be responsible for destroying everything she had worked for. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire tragedy was the impact on 7-year-old Elena McDonald. This little girl had gone to bed on February 28th with both of her parents in the house. She had woken up on March 1st to find her mother gone and her father acting strangely. And now, just days later, her father was being arrested while her mother was still missing. The community response to Andrian's disappearance was overwhelming. Former Air Force serviceman Bobby Green organized volunteer search parties that covered hundreds of miles of terrain around San Antonio. These weren't professional search and rescue teams. These were ordinary citizens who had been touched by Andrian's story and wanted to help bring her home. They searched wooded areas behind hospitals, thinking Andre might have chosen locations that were familiar to him. They looked for disturbed earth, broken branches, tire tracks, anything that might indicate where a body had been hidden. Day after day, week after week. These volunteers continued their efforts even as hope began to fade. Meanwhile, Andre was released from jail while awaiting trial on the evidence tampering charges. Incredibly, he took over management of Starlight Homes, the business that Andrian had built from nothing. The same facilities that had been her pride and joy were now being run by the man suspected of killing her. As investigators dug deeper into the McDonald marriage, they discovered that the picture-perfect relationship had been hiding some serious cracks. Text messages and social media posts revealed ongoing arguments about money, business decisions, and control. There were allegations of infidelity on both sides, accusations about who deserved credit for their business success, and increasingly heated exchanges about the direction of their relationship. Friends who had once described the McDonalds as the ideal couple began sharing stories that painted a different picture. There had been physical altercations before, moments of tension that had made people uncomfortable. The night before a Christmas party in 2018, witnesses described seeing Andre and Andrian grappling on their kitchen floor, fighting over something that had escalated beyond words. For 4 months, the search for Andrian continued with no results. Investigators followed up on hundreds of tips, searched dozens of locations, and interviewed anyone who might have information about what had happened to her. But Texas is a big state, and hiding a body in the vast stretches of rural land around San Antonio wouldn't be impossible for someone who knew what they were doing. Then, on July 11th, 2019, 133 days after Andrian McDonald had vanished from her home, a farmer named Clifton Cundiff made a discovery that would finally bring this case to its tragic conclusion. Cundiff had taken his tractor out to retrieve a cow skull that had been spotted along the tree line of his property, about 6 miles from the McDonald residence. But when he got closer to examine what he thought was just another piece of farm debris, he realized he was looking at something much more significant. There, partially concealed by vegetation and scattered by months of exposure to the elements, were human skeletal remains. The bones that Clifton Cundiff had stumbled upon belonged to Andrian McDonald. The discovery of Andrian's body changed everything about this case. What had been a missing persons investigation with charges of evidence tampering suddenly became a murder case with physical proof of the crime. Andre McDonald was arrested again, this time charged with the murder of his wife. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of what had happened in the McDonald home during those final hours. Andre's own testimony would provide details that no one could have imagined, admitting to actions that were so brutal and calculated that they shocked even experienced investigators. After being found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, Andre McDonald was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The jury had rejected his claims of self-defense but couldn't unanimously agree that his actions had been premeditated murder. Today, Andrian's mother Maureen and sister Cindy are raising young Elena, trying to help her process the unimaginable trauma of losing both parents in such a violent way. The Starlight Homes business that Andrian had built with such dedication and care has been closed. Another casualty of the violence that destroyed the McDonald family. The American dream that Andrian McDonald had pursued so successfully had been cut short by the very person who had helped her achieve it. Her story serves as a reminder that success and wealth can't protect us from the people closest to us, and that sometimes the greatest dangers come from within our own homes. Andrian McDonald came to America with nothing but hope and determination. She built an empire, touched countless lives through her work, and created something meaningful that served her community. Her legacy should have been one of inspiration and achievement. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about trust, ambition, and the devastating consequences when love turns to jealousy and control. If you found this case as compelling and tragic as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. Cases like this one require us to examine the complex dynamics of domestic relationships and the warning signs that might help prevent future tragedies. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this case you found most disturbing and what you think could have been done differently to save Andrian's life. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember that the people we trust the most sometimes have the greatest power to hurt us. When the clock struck 8:30 on that cold February evening in New Haven, Connecticut, the sound of gunfire shattered the quiet East Rock neighborhood. What seemed like a simple fender bender would soon reveal itself as something far more sinister. A brilliant Yale graduate student lay dead in the street, shot 8 times in what investigators would discover was not a case of road rage gone wrong, but rather a calculated act of obsession and murder that would lead police on a cross-country manhunt. This is the story of how a single gunshot would unravel a web of deception, expose a dangerous fixation, and ultimately bring justice for a young man whose life was cut tragically short. But to understand how we got to that fatal night, we need to go back to where it all began. The first signs of trouble started months before Kevin Jiang's murder, when residents across New Haven began reporting a disturbing pattern of violence. December 11th, 2020 marked the beginning of what police would later recognize as a calculated campaign of terror. 5 gunshots rang out on Huntington Street, with multiple rounds striking an occupied residence. Thankfully, no one was injured, but investigators found something telling at the scene. 45 caliber shell casings scattered across the ground. Just over a month later, on January 15th, 2021, another family home was targeted. Once again, the house was occupied, but fortune smiled on the residents as no one was harmed. The pattern continued into February, with 2 more shootings occurring on February 5th and 6th. Each incident shared disturbing similarities: residential homes being peppered with gunfire, families inside narrowly escaping injury, and those distinctive 45 caliber casings left behind like a calling card. What made these shootings particularly unnerving was their apparent randomness. The targeted homes seemed to have no connection to each other, and the families inside had no idea why someone would want to terrorize them. Police were baffled by the lack of obvious motive, but they knew one thing for certain: someone was escalating their violence, and it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. The final piece of this deadly puzzle would fall into place on Saturday night, February 6th, 2021. At approximately 8:00 p.m., the peaceful East Rock neighborhood was shattered by the sound of gunfire once again. But this time, the violence wouldn't end with property damage and shattered windows. This time, someone would die. Kevin Jiang was the kind of person who seemed to have everything going for him. At 26 years old, he was pursuing his graduate degree at Yale's prestigious School of the Environment, following his passion for conservation and environmental protection. But Kevin's journey to New Haven hadn't been a straight path. Born and raised in Chicago, he had served his country with honor as a tank officer in the Army National Guard, demonstrating the same dedication and discipline that would later serve him well in his academic pursuits. Those who knew Kevin described him as genuinely happy and deeply spiritual. He was the kind of person who lit up a room with his presence, always ready with a smile or an encouraging word. His social media presence reflected this positive outlook, with frequent posts about fitness, faith, and his love for the outdoors. Kevin's YouTube channel, Fitness with Kevin, showcased his enthusiasm for helping others live healthier lives. Just 1 week before his death, Kevin had shared news that filled him with joy. He had gotten engaged to the love of his life, Zion Perry. The Facebook post announcing their engagement radiated happiness, showing a young couple deeply in love and excited about their future together. For Kevin, everything seemed to be falling into place. Zion Perry was every bit Kevin's intellectual equal, a brilliant student from Pennsylvania. She had excelled academically throughout her life, earning her way to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for her undergraduate studies. Like Kevin, she was pursuing advanced studies at Yale, working toward her PhD in molecular biophysics and biochemistry. The two had met at a Christian retreat in January 2020, bonding over their shared faith, love of nature, and commitment to scientific discovery. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Friends described seeing them together as witnessing something special. Two people who truly brought out the best in each other. Kevin's fellow soldiers in the National Guard could hear the love in his voice when he spoke about Zion, and those close to the couple knew they were witnessing something rare and beautiful. On that fateful February evening, Kevin and Zion had spent a perfect day together. They had gone ice fishing, enjoying the winter weather and each other's company. Afterward, they shared dinner at Zion's house, talking and laughing as young couples in love do. Around 8:30 p.m., Kevin kissed Zion goodbye and headed out to his black Prius for the short drive home. He would never make it. Just 2 blocks from Zion's house, Kevin's peaceful evening took a violent turn. According to witnesses who would later speak to police, they heard the distinctive sound of a car accident. Nothing major, just the kind of minor fender bender that happens countless times every day across America. What followed, however, was anything but routine. Witnesses described seeing Kevin's Prius come to a stop in the middle of the road, hazard lights blinking. Behind him, a dark-colored SUV had pulled up, apparently the other vehicle involved in the collision. In what seemed like a normal response to a minor accident, Kevin got out of his car and walked back toward the SUV, presumably to exchange insurance information and assess the damage. But as Kevin approached the other vehicle, the situation took a horrifying turn. Gunshots erupted into the quiet night, the muzzle flash visible from the driver's side of the SUV. Witnesses watched in horror as Kevin fell to the ground, and then watched in disbelief as the shooter got out of the vehicle and continued firing at the young man as he lay helpless in the street. When the gunfire finally stopped, 8 shots had been fired. Kevin Jiang, the devoted son, loving fiancé, and dedicated student, was dead. The dark SUV disappeared into the night, leaving behind a community in shock and a family devastated by an incomprehensible loss. Detective David Zaweski arrived at the crime scene to find a tragedy that would haunt him for months to come. Kevin's body lay in the street, covered by a white sheet, while crime scene investigators methodically documented the evidence. The .45 caliber shell casings scattered around the scene immediately caught Zaweski's attention. They were identical to those found at the previous shootings around the city. As detectives began their investigation, they discovered something that would prove crucial to solving the case. Kevin's Prius sat abandoned in the middle of the road, hazard lights still flashing, with damage to the rear bumper that told a story. The impression left on the bumper appeared to match a license plate holder, suggesting the collision had been relatively minor. Certainly not the kind of accident that would typically escalate to deadly violence. The positioning of Kevin's body and the pattern of shell casings told investigators that this was no random act of road rage. The evidence suggested that Kevin had been shot multiple times at close range, with some shots fired while he was already down on the ground. This level of violence spoke to something personal, something that went far beyond a simple traffic dispute. As news of Kevin's murder spread through the Yale community and beyond, those who knew him struggled to comprehend what had happened. Here was a young man with no enemies, no history of violence, no apparent reason for anyone to want him dead. He was weeks away from his 27th birthday, newly engaged, and excited about his future. The senseless nature of his death made it all the more tragic. What investigators didn't know in those first crucial hours was that they were dealing with someone who had planned this murder with chilling precision. As Detective Zaweski and his partner Stephen Cunningham worked through the night, processing the crime scene and interviewing witnesses, the killer was already putting the next phase of his escape plan into motion. Less than 30 minutes after Kevin's murder, a security guard at Sims Metal Management scrapyard in North Haven received an unwelcome visitor. The guard called 911 to report someone driving erratically through the facility, seemingly lost and confused. When North Haven police officers Jeffrey Mills and Marcus Aries responded to the call, they found a dark SUV stuck on snow-covered railroad tracks near the rear exit of the yard. The driver appeared calm and cooperative when officers approached. He identified himself as Ching-Suan Pan, a 29-year-old graduate student from Malden, Massachusetts. Pan's explanation was simple. He had taken a wrong turn, gotten lost, and ended up stuck on the tracks while trying to find his way back to the highway. His demeanor was so ordinary, so unremarkable, that Officer Mills later described him as perfectly calm and not nervous at all. What Mills noticed during their interaction would later prove crucial to the investigation. Pan was wearing a distinctive yellow jacket, and in the vehicle, officers observed a blue bag and a briefcase in the back seat. At the time, these details seemed inconsequential, just the belongings of a lost traveler who needed help getting unstuck. After calling a tow truck to free Pan's vehicle from the tracks, officers arranged for him to be dropped off at a nearby Best Western hotel for the night. It seemed like a routine assist to a stranded motorist. Mills cleared the call and moved on, having no idea he had just encountered a cold-blooded killer. But Pan's night was far from over. Hours later, around 11 in the morning on February 7th, an employee at an Arby's restaurant near the Best Western made a discovery that would blow the case wide open. While doing routine maintenance around the building, the worker found 3 bags discarded on the grass near the north entrance. When police examined the contents of those bags, their investigation took a dramatic turn. Inside, they found a .45 caliber handgun along with approximately 10 boxes of ammunition. Even more telling were the bags themselves. One was a blue retail bag with a Massachusetts logo, and another was a small black leather case. Officer Mills immediately recognized these as identical to the bags he had seen in Pan's vehicle the night before. The connection became even more apparent when officers examined a yellow jacket that had been discarded with the weapon and ammunition. It was the same distinctive jacket Pan had been wearing during their encounter at the scrapyard. The timing and location of the discovery, just steps away from where Pan had been dropped off, painted a clear picture of someone desperately trying to dispose of evidence. When investigators tested the firearm, their suspicions were confirmed. The .45 caliber handgun matched the shell casings found at Kevin's murder scene, as well as those recovered from the 4 previous shootings around New Haven. They finally had their smoking gun. Quite literally, Detective Zaweski immediately dispatched officers to the Best Western Hotel where Pan had been staying. When they gained access to room 276, they found it completely clean and unused, as if no one had spent the night there. Pan had vanished without a trace. The search for Pan led investigators to his family home in Malden, Massachusetts, an affluent suburb outside Boston. When Detective Joe Galvin knocked on the door of the well-appointed residence, no one answered. The house was empty, dark, and gave no indication of when its occupants might return. This discovery raised even more troubling questions. Had Pan's family simply gone on vacation? Or were they potentially victims of their own son, given the violent nature of Kevin's murder? Investigators couldn't rule out the possibility that Pan had harmed his parents as well. The stakes of finding him had just gotten significantly higher. As Zaweski dug deeper into Pan's background, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Pan was a highly intelligent graduate student at MIT, studying artificial intelligence and computer science. His academic credentials were impressive, but his social media presence told a different story. His Facebook page was largely inactive, with his last post dating back to 2016. He appeared to be someone who lived in the shadows, keeping his thoughts and activities to himself. The breakthrough came when Zaweski began examining Pan's Facebook friends list. While Kevin Jiang's name didn't appear anywhere on Pan's profile, one name immediately caught the detective's attention: Zion Perry, Kevin's fiancée. This was the connection investigators had been searching for. When Zaweski contacted Zion to ask about her relationship with Pan, she was completely shocked to learn he was a person of interest in Kevin's murder. She explained that she had met Pan during her time at MIT in 2019, but they were merely acquaintances, never close friends, and certainly never romantic partners. The last time they had communicated was in May 2020, when Pan had reached out through Facebook Messenger to congratulate her on her graduation. Zion recalled that during that final conversation, Pan had asked to FaceTime with her, but she had politely declined. She had thought nothing of it at the time, just a former classmate trying to reconnect. She had no idea that this seemingly innocent interaction might have sparked something dangerous in Pan's mind. As investigators delved deeper into Zion's social media activity, they discovered something that would prove to be the key to understanding Pan's motive. In the weeks leading up to Kevin's murder, Zion had been posting regularly about her relationship with Kevin, culminating in her joyful announcement of their engagement just 1 week before the killing. The timing was not coincidental. Investigators began to theorize that Pan had been quietly monitoring Zion's social media activity, watching from afar as she fell in love with someone else. The engagement announcement may have been the final trigger that pushed him from obsession to violence. This wasn't a case of road rage or random violence. This was something far more sinister, a calculated murder born from jealousy and obsession. Pan had spent months planning Kevin's death, using the earlier shootings around New Haven to create a false pattern that would mislead investigators into thinking Kevin's murder was just another random act of violence. The evidence of Pan's meticulous planning became clearer as investigators traced his activities in the weeks before the murder. They discovered that Pan had contacted multiple car dealerships, claiming he needed to test drive vehicles for a camping trip. Each of these test drives coincided perfectly with one of the .45 caliber shootings around New Haven. Pan's strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. By creating a pattern of seemingly random shootings, he hoped to convince police that Kevin's murder was just another incident in a series of unrelated violence. He never intended for investigators to connect the dots between him, Zion, and Kevin. But Pan had made one crucial mistake. In his careful planning, he had failed to account for the possibility that his getaway vehicle might get stuck on railroad tracks, putting him in direct contact with police just minutes after committing murder. That single mishap would ultimately unravel his entire scheme and set in motion the events that would lead to his capture. As the investigation intensified, one thing became clear: this was no longer just a murder case. This was a manhunt for a dangerous individual who had demonstrated both the intelligence to plan a complex crime and the ruthlessness to execute it. The question now was whether law enforcement could find him before he disappeared forever. As the manhunt for Chingsuan Pan intensified, U.S. Marshals discovered that Pan and his parents had vanished together, leaving investigators to wonder if this was part of a larger conspiracy. Deputy Marshal Kevin Perro and his team realized they weren't just hunting a lone killer anymore. They were dealing with a family that seemed willing to go to extraordinary lengths to help their son escape justice. The breakthrough came when investigators noticed unusual banking activity on Pan's parents' accounts. Large sums of cash were being withdrawn regularly, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, amounts substantial enough to fund a prolonged period of hiding or even facilitate an escape from the country. Given that Pan's family had connections in China, the possibility of international flight became a very real concern. Surveillance footage from a Georgia shopping mall revealed something even more troubling. Pan's father was captured on camera purchasing a computer, but roughly 10 minutes later, another figure matching Pan's description appeared in the same store. The story of Pan's supposed suicide in the Georgia woods was clearly fabricated for weeks. The cat-and-mouse game continued. Pan's parents would travel south. Their rental car's GPS would mysteriously go dark. Then they would resurface heading north again. It became clear that Pan had taught his family the same counter-surveillance techniques he had used to evade detection while planning Kevin's murder. The game finally ended on May 4th, 2021, when Pan's parents made one final trip south, this time accompanied by another couple, likely an attempt to make their journey appear routine. After months of patience and meticulous surveillance, U.S. Marshals tracked them to a hotel in North Carolina. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Late one night, Pan's mother approached the hotel clerk's desk and asked to borrow his phone. After she finished her call, she deleted the number from his device, but investigators were able to recover it. That number led them to a boarding house near Alabama State University in Montgomery. When 20 federal agents surrounded the boarding house, Pan emerged without resistance. "I'm who you're looking for," he said simply. On his person, investigators found $20,000 in cash, his father's passport, 7 SIM cards, and a computer. The tools of someone who had been living in hiding for months. The evidence against Pan was overwhelming. DNA analysis confirmed his genetic material was on the murder weapon and ammunition found outside the Arby's. Kevin's blood was discovered on Pan's hat and the gear shift of the SUV he had been driving. The license plate impression on Kevin's car matched the bumper of Pan's vehicle perfectly. Perhaps most damning of all was the revelation that Pan had spent months methodically planning not just Kevin's murder, but an elaborate scheme to mislead investigators. The 4 shootings preceding Kevin's death weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully orchestrated diversions designed to make Kevin's murder appear to be part of a pattern of senseless crime. On February 29, 2024, nearly 3 years after Kevin's death, Pan finally faced justice. In a packed courtroom, he pleaded guilty to murder in exchange for a sentence of 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer, William Jaros, acknowledged that the evidence against his client was simply overwhelming. At his sentencing hearing in April 2024, Pan sat silently as Kevin's loved ones delivered victim impact statements that painted a picture of the profound loss his actions had caused. Kevin's mother, speaking through a family friend, described dreams of grandchildren that would never come to pass, of holidays that felt empty, of a future stolen by senseless violence. But it was Zion Perry's words that seemed to have the greatest impact. Looking directly at Pan, she spoke of mercy and forgiveness, demonstrating the same grace and strength that had attracted Kevin to her in the first place. Her ability to find compassion even for the man who had destroyed her happiness spoke to the kind of person Kevin had fallen in love with. When Pan finally addressed the court, his words were brief and hollow. "I feel sorry for what my actions have caused," he said, offering no explanation for why he had taken Kevin's life. The court imposed the agreed-upon sentence of 35 years, and Pan was led away in handcuffs to begin serving his time. The case officially closed, but questions remained. Investigators considered whether to charge Pan's parents as accessories, ultimately deciding they couldn't prove the parents knew about the murder when they helped their son flee. Still, their willingness to aid Pan's escape raised troubling questions about how far a family might go to protect one of their own. Today, Kevin Jiang rests in a Connecticut cemetery, buried with full military honors just 2 days before what would have been his 27th birthday. His friends from the Army National Guard visit regularly, and many say they still feel his presence. A reminder that while his life was cut tragically short, his impact on those who knew him continues. Lieutenant Nay Hubbard, Kevin's fellow soldier, perhaps put it best when she visited his grave after speaking about the case. Standing among the headstones, she felt what she described as Kevin's spirit, telling her not to be sad, but to carry on and keep going. It was, she said, exactly the kind of encouragement the Kevin she knew would have offered. The Ivy League murder case serves as a stark reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. That obsession can drive even the most educated minds to commit unspeakable acts. but it also demonstrates the power of meticulous police work, the importance of community cooperation, and ultimately, the triumph of justice over deception. For Zion Perry, Kevin's family, and all those whose lives were touched by this tragedy, the healing continues. Kevin Jong's legacy lives on not in the violence that ended his life, but in the love he shared, the service he gave to his country, and the bright future he represented. In the end, that may be the most important part of this story. Not how Kevin died, but how he lived.